the reality is that this game Gotham Knights, which is out now, PlayStation 5, it was supposed to come to PlayStation 4, but that iteration was canceled late in development. It runs at only 30 frames, and this has been an interesting conversation. Let's start with Josh Kisscalt, though, who calls it like it is. He says, "Hey, CDC, I'm just curious if Chris is taking full responsibility for the current hysteria over 30 frames. Before Chris, Colin talked about not caring about frame rate, but now he's refusing to play a game at 30 frames. I rarely heard anyone discussing frame rate, and now it's trending Twitter topic. Mr. Raygun, how does it feel to have complete control over the zeitgeist and future of gaming? Thanks, and keep it rocking." A lot of people are surprised by this. I won't play this game. Like, it's you actually have successfully broken me. I was watching Micah play Witcher 2 the other day, and I was like, ooh.
Yeah.
Like, this is rough. You know, like you really can tell. I don't know what I was thinking, really. I guess it's when you're bombarded with the same thing over and over again, I think you just become acclimated to it. And in the PS3 era specifically, we became acclimated at 30 frames. That's what everything was going to run at. That was it.
Yeah.
And that's the best you can hope for. And I think that once that my mind broke of that, I just saw it for what it was. And it's inexcusable to release a game on PS5 at 30 frames. I mean, that's my opinion. What do you think?
No, I totally agree. I was already kind of only kind of curious about this game, but now certainly not. Like I cannot abide by it. It's the thing about it is, and I think you're probably right with the familiarity thing, where it's like, okay, well, everything else was 30 frames per second. This is our only option. If we want to interface with this medium at all, we're going to have to deal with this kind of standard. So of course we're used to it. And there was a time too where I was totally fine with 30 frames per second. There are games, by the way, that do 30 frames per second better than others. I do think there is such a thing as I know it sounds funny, but there is such thing as a smooth 30 frames per second. And
Uncharted
you can see,
is a great example.
Uncharted is a great example. There are games. It's all about the frame pacing, and Digital Foundry is way better at explaining this stuff than I am. So I'll leave it to them. They make really, really fantastic breakdowns of all this stuff, and they explain why certain 30 frames per second games feel better than others. But just as a general rule now, with modern hardware and with modern PCs and even with modern consoles, the standard is now 60 frames per second. It is kind of difficult to find a modern game now that doesn't support 60 frames per second, whether it be in some kind of performance mode or just by base default. And so when you have the exception to the rule be 30 frames per second, that's just, there's no reason at that point to subject yourself to that. Because before we would have the one-off games that were 60 frames back in the day. I think Call of Duty was actually 60 frames per second, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, but I remember Call of Duty feeling a lot smoother than other games. And I remember like, oh, cool. It's like a nice
and I remember
gem.
Shadowfall. I think Shadowfall launched at 60
right.
as well.
There was a point in time where 60 was a gem and you'd be like, ooh, cool. But it's still not the standard. Now it is the standard, and to have anything that is not the standard come out and be boastful about it, it's like, oh, hey, here's a new video game, new PS5 exclusive, 30 frames. No, that's not why we got these machines. If I wanted to play at 30 frames per second, I would have stayed on PS4, and I'm not. So I don't know. I don't know who decided this. You need at the bare minimum, you need a performance mode. I am fine sacrificing ray tracing or some like random, like, oh, I don't need the building that's on the horizon to be rendered at full 4K. I don't need that. I would much rather have a smooth experience. And for them not supporting this is insane to me. But I'm a frame rate snob, so that's well,
me. But I think a lot of people have increasingly become so, Chris. I think you were not ahead of your time, because I mean, I knew people at IGN that were obsessed with this shit too. Although I knew people at IGN that were on the exact opposite spectrum. I remember Mitch Dyer getting into a lot of shit. We brought this up in the past for saying you can't even see 720, the difference between 1080 and 720, that kind of stuff.
That's crazy.
At more than at smaller than 30 inches or whatever. I don't know what the argument was, but it got him in like some sort of trouble. And so there's always been people on both sides of this for me. I've always kind of just ignored it because I've never been much of a fidelity person. And what I've realized is The Last of Us Part 1 is a great example, and Horizon Forbidden West is a great example, where I started Horizon Forbidden West at 60 frames, and I'm like, I just want to see what it looks like, and maybe it'll look better in the the high fidelity 4K mode. But when I started playing it at 60 frames at 1080 or whatever it was, or better than 1080, 1440, whatever it was running at, I was like, this looks fucking awesome. Like, I don't understand why it would need to look any better than this. And I don't need to sacrifice the frame rate to get all the other stuff that I feel like it would just be slightly additive as opposed to a frame rate that is substantially additive, especially in fast moving games. Like playing Horizon at 30 frames, like, ooh, what? Like how? I don't know about that. And I've just become acclimated in a different way where I'm like, the second I saw that 30 frames thing from Arkham Knights, I'm like, nope, not for me. Sorry, not on PS5.
It's a matter of video games are an interactive medium. So what takes precedence more than anything is how it feels to interact with. And if you have something that looks like, okay, it's 30 frames per second, but it's 4K and it looks great. That's great for people who are watching me play, I guess. But no, like I want it to feel good because that's the whole point of interacting with this game in the first place. It's the whole point of interacting with this medium is to get the feel of it feeling as good as possible. And it just, I don't know, man. It is wild. By the way, I know you mentioned this in a little parentheses, but Plague Tale also has this limit. And as much as I am looking forward to Plague Tale, I cannot. I can't. I'm not doing it. Not until this must have a patch available at some point.
I would assume so. I mean, I was surprised. Remember when we were talking about Asobo, we've really complimented them a lot. And obviously these games are very well received. I'm not saying anything about that, but we were wondering, like, how did you make a game like this in under 3 years? There you go. And there are sacrifices on the other end. It's funny that you say that because I felt like a Plague Tale. I was going to ask you about that because I felt like that game is more filmic and would be acceptable at 30 frames. I was surprised by that because I don't understand how you can't get that to going at 60 frames, but I wasn't as offended on a gameplay level because it's a much more
cinematic. It's a cinematic game. Yeah, I mean, I get that. I did consider it for that reason. It's like, oh, maybe it's because it's like slower and it's like a little bit more cinematic, but at the same time, it's like I just care too much about. I'm going to notice. That's the thing. It's like I'm going to notice. It's going to feel worse to me, even if it's not, even if all those extra frames aren't necessary to get the point of the game across, because it's not like a fast-paced action game like Arkham or not Arkham, Gotham Knights is. It's still just my preferred baseline for playing video games, and if I can just wait to play this game at my preferred baseline, I'd rather just do that than jump in and have a subpar experience. I've heard, by the way, very good things about it.
I think it looks cool, man. I've said that before. I think it looks cool.
Yeah, you know? I'm looking forward to it, but I can't do 30 anymore, man. I just can't. No exceptions.
Yeah, I'm basically the same way, just on principle. And I know it could be apples to oranges and it could be a little reductive, but it's like, dude, if they're getting Call of Duty with like a bunch of different players running on PS5 at 60 frames and it looks beautiful, like you can do it. You know, I don't want any excuses as to how this game needs to be at 30 frames for this, that, the other thing. It's like, what nonsense? What are you talking about? That's just weird. And I can only imagine how this game ran on PS4. I mean, I could only imagine what that canceled version was like. They hid this to the very last minute. They hid this. And it's worth noting that no one said this when the game was being played in media rounds, that the game was 30 frames. It wasn't like they were playing a fast 60 frame version. Why didn't anyone report that?
That is weird.
It might have been playing on PC, but I didn't check out any of the previews.
Oh yeah, that's true, I guess.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that it's a fairly big deal. I don't know, Dustin, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I guess just that it's really interesting looking. There's I think a blog post from someone at Insomniac where they talked about, this was many years ago during the PS3 era, that they found that there was no data showing that a better performing game sells better at the time during the PS3 era, is that people cared about graphics and resolution above all else. And now looking back, which I think that people did care about frame rate, which is why Call of Duty succeeded over other FPSs at the time, because it was a 60 FPS game in an era of a lot of 30 FPS shooters. But it's interesting now, and maybe this is something that we can actually thank the console wars for, is how frame rate, and I mean, Digital Foundry, not that they're trying to be cannon fodder for console war stuff, but this brought a lot of attention to frame rates, and people started to care about this, which is fantastic as far as I'm concerned, just because there was a time where if you wanted to play games at high frame rates, you had to go to PC. There was no option. And so it's good to see the standard change. And I hope that this is a lesson for other developers that the standard has changed. And so your development has to change. You have to account for performance modes always now going forward.
All right. I agree, by the way. I just don't understand it when you have it's as you said, there were pioneering games that people were trying to reach towards. But now that pioneering games don't reach towards that anymore, but rather just deliver that as it is, you would just wonder, well, okay, so what's wrong? That to me makes me wonder what's wrong with your game. I mean, that's like, especially Plague Tale, as much as it doesn't bother me, I'm not going to play it probably anyway, so that doesn't matter, but it's like, wow.
It's the rats.
It's very, the rat physics, of course.
Yeah.